Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell testified yesterday and today before the House and Senate committees that oversee the Federal Reserve. And while these testimonies are typically dry affairs, there was more attention than usual on the hearings after President Trump's numerous messages and public demands for the chairman to lower interest rates. Did the chairman offer a good explanation as to why he and his colleagues decided that the interest rate should remain where it's at? Here to talk about that is Congressman Marlin Stutzman, a member of the House Financial Services Committee, where the chairman testified yesterday. He represents the 3rd Congressional District of Indiana. Representative Stutzman, welcome back to Washington Watch. Good to see you.
Thanks, Tony. Always good to be with you.
Did you get a good explanation yesterday as to why the interest rates have not come down?
Well, you know what? I don't know if Chairman Powell is an attorney, but he gave an answer like an attorney, I guess. Didn't give a really clear answer. You know, the Fed does have a dual mandate. Their focus is supposed to be keeping inflation around the 2% mark and then also full employment. Well, we have both of those, and inflation has been held in check and is actually coming down, and also employment is fairly strong. And that was why I asked him the question about housing. The housing market is about as flat as we've seen since the recession, almost 15 years ago. And there really was no good answer about why keeping the interest rates where they're at now be other than the fact that he's kind of, muzzled because he's got to take all sectors into consideration, including agriculture, manufacturing, and then, of course, the housing market. But my belief is that we really are holding Americans, they're stuck in this economy because of the interest rates. And my hope is that he would take, not only, our thoughts, but also the president's and vice president's thoughts into consideration, because we're hearing from our constituents that they're really, stuck in a spot where it's not easy to move from one house to another.
So the role of this monetary policy of when you have a hot economy, interest rates are, when inflation is going up, you raise interest rates to cool things off. But if you keep it too long, you have the potential of stalling out the economy. And as you've pointed out, housing sales are going down, construction is down because the cost of borrowing money is pretty high.
It is. In fact, the one sector that actually is doing well, if any, that's multifamily housing, apartment complexes. Those are being built because people are able to charge rent because simply, folks aren't able to buy. In fact, the average age for young individuals to buy a house used to be around the 28-year-old mark, and now it's around the 35 to 38-year-old mark. So young people just aren't in a spot to be able to buy.
And that's not a good thing. Because home ownership has a profound, there's two things that impact people's thinking and their citizenship engagement. Number one is when they have children. Number two is when they buy a house. They become more fiscally conservative when they buy a house and become a homeowner, and they become more socially conservative when they have children.
That's exactly right. And, it's just that ownership piece that makes us all behave differently, because we're not going to let the grass grow out front because we don't want to be that house on the block. We want to make sure we keep our house up because it holds its value. That was always something that my parents encouraged us kids to do, was to buy a house so that way you are in the market. Of course, timing is always can be tricky, but as you said, holding these interest rates flat has really held the housing market in this country flat. And I think there's so many bright spots that, under the Trump economy, that things are ready to take off. But a lot of folks just aren't selling their house because it's not easy to go from that 3% mortgage rate that they have, which they may end up in a 6% mortgage rate and double.
So it's really a throttle on the economy, especially as we get these tax cuts that could grow the economy even more. I mean, to extend these tax cuts, at least give people certainty of what's ahead, that could fuel the economy, but high interest rates will be a throttle on that. There's one other aspect of that interest rate I want to ask you about, because the United States government pays interest on the money it borrows, and so that high interest rate affects the U.S. government.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's a great point, Tony. Another good reason, and that would be good for our economy and good for the federal budget, is keeping those interest rates down, because right now the federal budget, we're paying on our national debt, which is around 36 trillion, almost 37 trillion. We're paying interest to the tune of a trillion dollars a year. That's $1 trillion a year that's not going to our military. That's $1 trillion a year that's not going to pay down this debt. And so if those interest rates would be lower, that would also be a savings. I know that the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, talks about this frequently, that if interest rates were at a modest spot, then it would make a big difference. The one thing, too, that the Fed is not supposed to be political, and this is what really bothered me and a lot of others, is that the Fed actually lowered the interest rate right before the election in 2024. And I've generally, said, hey, they're a steady hand at the wheel, but that really made me think twice about their political lens, because by lowering that interest rate right before the election, it felt like they were trying to give the economy a boost for Kamala. So again, I'm sure they've got a different answer on that, but the timing is everything when they do this.
Marlin, I've been around for a while, and I've not seen any entity in D.C. that's not political. Now, some acknowledge it, and some don't, but they're all political. Speaking of that, one final question on the Federal Reserve. It announced earlier this week that it was directing its supervisors to no longer consider reputational risk when examining banks. Explain that, because that goes back to what we saw during the Biden administration of debanking conservatives.
Yeah, and this is it's a move. It's a good move. Now, banks can still look at reputational risk. Now, for example, and we see this always on the conservative side, Tony, we hardly ever see banks that have decided not to bank a particular industry on the left, but it's the gun owner shops that have a difficult time getting banks to bank them. There's also of course, fossil fuels in the energy sector. You've got this ESG that was running around for some time, and it is still there, but environmental social governance, it's government's way of controlling the economy on that social level, because they don't like fossil fuels, or they don't like the Second Amendment, and they don't support Americans' ability to own a gun to not only defend themselves, but it's our constitutional right. But this is a good move to make sure that we as citizens are protected. Now, we need to keep track of those banks that do this, and I think the private sector, the free market, can help monitor that as well.
Agree that it's a good move, but I ask you, is it a move that they're making out of fear that the Trump administration, by executive order, might lean in on this issue?
Well, you know what, I hope so. And if President Trump still does the executive order, I'd be fine with that as well, because I think that's what, we're all tired of in America, is this woke agenda that has been forced on us by Washington, D.C., and it's, of course, accelerated by the Biden administration. We're still dealing with the ramifications of that. But, these agencies, boy, like you said, they are political. They're deeply entrenched. I had dinner, it was one time with Justice Scalia, and he said, guys, don't fool yourselves that you think that the Supreme Court justices aren't political. They are. They all go to the same cocktail parties together, and they like to talk politics. So even in our institutions that are supposed to be nonpartisan, non-political, they are. And so hopefully this is a sign that they're watching Trump's lead, and that Trump will lean onto these issues if he has to.
Marlin Stutzman, always great to see you, my friend. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Tony. Great to see you.